Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait a few seconds while people join us. It's great to have you here. We're going to have a wonderful conversation tonight. We really want to thank you for joining us. This very powerful documentary, The Night Won't End, Biden's War on Gaza. Hopefully all of you got a chance to watch the full thing before joining us today. My name is Jennifer Bing, and I direct the U.S. Palestine Activism Program at the American Friends Service Committee. And tonight we are going to meet in the webinar format with all participants. That's all of you can submit questions on the Q&A function, which you can see on Zoom is at the lower part of your screen. So that we optimize our attention to our guests, we will not be using the chat function. We are grateful to my colleague Diana, who's helping us with technology tonight. This program is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent to all who registered within the week, we hope. We'll also be posting this webinar on our AFSC.org website. So I appreciate all of you who are joining us today, because the subject of the film, indeed, the news of the past year, even this week, are difficult to absorb. I know many, including myself, will never forget many of the painful scenes in this film, but I hope our time together on this webinar will help renew our resolve to continue the critical work of telling the stories of Gaza, of Palestine, and demanding that our leaders end their complicity with these ongoing war crimes. For the next hour, I hope you will mute all those requests that I know you're getting on your phone and email from politicians asking for donations. Instead, listen to these two remarkable women who brought us this powerful documentary. First, I'd like to introduce and welcome the director and producer of the film, Kavitha Chekuru. Kavitha is a journalist and documentary filmmaker focused on human rights and security. Her documentary reporting has covered Afghanistan, Palestine, the US, and Latin America. Her work has also been recognized with the George Polk Foreign Reporting Award, the Overseas Press Club Edward R. Murrow Award by the Society of Professional Journalists, and with 5 news and documentary Emmy nominations. I'm sure you agree with me that the directing in this film was just outstanding. Also with Kavitha is the executive producer of Nights Won't End, Leila Al-Arian. Leila is a Washington, D.C. based journalist and the executive producer of Fault Lines, an award-winning current affairs program on Al Jazeera English that aired this feature-length documentary. She began her time on the program as a producer, making documentaries on subjects ranging from the Trump administration's Muslim ban to the impact of the heroin epidemic on children, and an investigation into factory conditions producing garments for Walmart and The Gap in Bangladesh. For her work, Leila has been honored with 2 news and documentary Emmys, a Peabody George Polk Reporting Award, Robert F. Kennedy Award in Journalism, and the Overseas Press Club Award. She has been nominated for 21 news and documentary Emmys. Her work has appeared in The Nation, Salon, The Independent, and other publications, and she's co-author of the book Collateral Damage: America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. You may have seen Leila earlier today, as she was a guest on the Electronic Intifada's live stream, talking about a new documentary she produced on Fault Lines called Starving Gaza, which I also encourage you to watch. She also recently was a guest of Peter Beinart's weekly show, where she shared more of her personal history, including the story of her grandmother fleeing to Gaza from Lid during the 1948 Nakba, and her family's continuing connection to Gaza. I was sad to hear on that program that Leila has lost hundreds of extended family members during the current genocide, of which, of course, makes me even more amazed that she was able to produce this powerful documentary. I'm hoping that most of our viewers today have watched the film prior to coming onto this webinar, but we will be showing a few clips during our conversation together. My two American Friends Service Committee colleagues, Noor Nablusi and Zoe Januzzi, who work with our U.S. Palestine activism team, have prepared a few questions that we hope will deepen our understanding and think about how we might motivate more people to view this important documentary and strengthen our demands for the U.S. to stop sending weapons and providing political support for the ongoing war. For our viewers who haven't watched or read about the documentary, it's important to note that Kavitha and Leila worked on this film without being able to enter Gaza, thus relying on the brave work of Palestinian journalists in Gaza. As we know from our own experience trying to communicate with our AFSC Palestinian staff in Gaza, communication to Gaza is often quite challenging, with power cuts and constant displacement due to Israeli military bombings that ensure that no place is safe in Gaza. Palestinian journalists and aid workers are often targeted by Israeli forces. Over 177 journalists and 300 aid workers have been killed in the last year in Gaza. It's remarkable that given these challenges, such powerful footage was collected from the interviews with survivors and witnesses in this film. These stories, combined with the forensic reconstructions that detail some of the horrifying atrocities Israel has perpetuated, make this documentary truly extraordinary. The film was put online in June of this year, even as the genocide in Gaza brought more human tragedies. And I'm sure that even when the film went for final editing, the producers here probably felt that it wasn't finished, especially as the second part of the film focus is on the Biden administration's role. The US government role is something I particularly want to comment on. There have been some very powerful short films about Gaza, including from journalists in Gaza posting on Instagram and TikTok this past year, but none has so well weaved together the stories from Gaza with the footage of US officials denying responsibility for these war crimes. Indeed, at points even making excuses for killing children. In some ways, I feel the film just builds our outrage throughout. I felt heartbreak and anger seeing the horrifying experience of grieving families in Gaza, followed by US State Department officials denying the humanity of these very families whose lives have been shattered by US bombs. Anyway, welcome to you both. Our admiration for you and your work is great. And we're going to turn now to our first 3-minute clip, a scene that is truly heartbreaking to watch, where a father is mourning the loss of his son. As my colleagues set that film clip up, is there anything that you'd like to say, Leila or Kavitha, before we show this clip? Or should we just go right into it?
I think you can go right into it.
Okay.
عشنا معاناة كتير صعبة، ما لقناش إلا طحين أولادنا، الأكل ما كناش نلاقيه أولادنا، ما كانش في إشي موفر. الصبح بالليل ناموا معي أولاد، الصبح بدري أكلوا معي وانبسطوا معي وكل إشي. اللي هو الولد الصغير بقول لي يابا، بقول له نعم يابا، قال لي يابا بدي بسكوت وبطعمر كنت أجيب له. ورحت أجيب له بسكوت وبطعمر، طلعت على السوق أجيب له.
Not long after he left to buy biscuits for his 2-year-old son, Firas, there was an attack on the building where they were staying. Abdullah's daughters can be seen here in this video from the Red Crescent.
انا كنت قريب الشظايا طاروا علي الشظايا صاروا انا من حب ما بقول لك سمعت الهوايه ربنا حسيت قلت يا رب استر اولادي يا رب استر اولادي.
His wife Miriam was one of at least 11 people killed in the attack, along with Firas.
كان نفسي كان يعني طول النهار اضلني حامله اطلع فيه كنت يعني كان لما ابقى مزعلان هو اللي يبسطني في الدار يعني كان روحي الثاني ابن فراس الصغير. جبت لك اياه يابا اللي بدك يابا خليه معك خليه معك. يوم حطيت البسكوت بكفن الولد كان شعوري يعني حزين كثير ما كنتش يعني مخي كان طاير من
This clip was of the Al-Ghaf family who fled their home in the north when the genocide began. They fled to Khan Yunis and then to Rafah, where these clips were taken. I think something that is extremely difficult for us to emotionally conceive is the reality that Palestinians in the occupied territories, and especially in Gaza, are essentially forced to broadcast their own grief and their own trauma. And this includes filming the brutal killing of your friends and your family, born out of fear that really concealing this suffering would render the rest of the world oblivious to the ongoing genocide, which is, of course, at the fault of Israel and the US. So I'm wondering, Kavitha and Leila, what does it mean for you both to be able to provide a platform for families like the Al-Ghaf family who've lost everything to tell their story? And what do you hope will come from sharing the extreme loss and the trauma that these families have endured in Gaza for the past year? Kavitha, we can start with you and then we can go to Leila.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this specific case, I feel like throughout all of this, since October 7th, because a lot of the news media isn't covering Gaza like they should be, that Palestinian journalists have had to rely on, and us, like all of us outside of Gaza have had to rely on social media. And to find out what's happening, to hear these stories. And so we're only getting it in snippets, in that case. And the Al-Ghaf family is one of those cases. When Bilal Khalid, a journalist in Gaza, he took this video of Abdullah Al-Ghaf mourning his son and placing the biscuits in his shroud. And I think, that clip went viral. And I know, to me, I saw that and I couldn't get it out of my head. And that was after seeing, at that point, it'd been 3 months because it happened at the end of December. After seeing so many horrors, so many atrocities already by that point. And I couldn't get that clip out of my head. And the thing is, even with that, in that case, we didn't know about, if you've watched the rest of the film, you'll see that he also, he had another son who was killed. And, nobody, I don't think anybody knew about that. And so you're only getting these like brief glimpses of the loss that I think so many families have experienced. And I think one of the things that we wanted to do with the film, aside from addressing the US part of it, was try to kind of build out a kind of bigger picture of these families and what they've gone through. And I don't think I think we barely scratched the surface, obviously, but, at least hopefully maybe it gave people a little bit more. But yeah, and it's all thanks to the Palestinian journalists in Gaza that we were able to do that.
Thank you. Leila, you can go ahead. Thank you.
I think I struggle with this question a lot because it's been going on for so long. I think had you asked me in the first couple of months of the genocide, I would have said, well, they're remarkable, they're strong, they're telling their stories because they have this hope that if they only tell their stories, the world will act and this will stop. And it's, I've been thinking for so many months, Kavitha and I have both, between the two of us, we probably have like I don't know, not to age us, but like 40 years of experience in journalism. I don't want to speak for Kavitha, but I've never seen a people going through such intense trauma willing to speak to the media. I mean, half of the time in the work that we do, we're trying to convince people to talk to us. And it's such a difficult thing to say, like, talk to me about the worst day of your life. The problem is for the Palestinians in Gaza, this year is the worst year of their life. It's ongoing, it's sustained. I mean, I think part of the challenge we had is asking these local journalists on the ground in Gaza, can you cover this incident that happened 3 months ago when there's ongoing atrocities every single day? So the sheer volume of the violence that's been unleashed on Gaza is overwhelming. The trauma, the fight and flight mode, the fact that people's cortisol levels have been like heightened and raised for a year straight, just trying to survive. All of the things that we don't even think about, like constantly humming drones above them, the war of starvation, what famine and malnutrition does to you. All of that compounded, and then being displaced multiple times and being asked to kind of broadcast their trauma and their grief and their loss to the world, that's asking a lot. And I think, I'm seeing more and more people not wanting to speak to journalists as much, and I honestly can't blame them. So one of the families that we filmed with, I mean, at a certain point, they said like, okay, we don't want to film anymore. I think there's a fear that the Israeli government, because they're just killing so many people at such a high volume, that anyone who speaks could be killed, or that journalists, if you're seen, because journalists have been killed in such high number, more than 75 have been killed, that speaking to a journalist who is a target puts you at risk. So there's a lot going on. So yeah, I mean, in our new film, Starving Gaza, the young parents who lost their 5-month-old son also stopped talking to the crew after their son passed away, because I'm sure they're thinking, our 5-month-old infant died. What is speaking to the media going to do? The world simply doesn't care about our suffering. That said, as a journalist, I feel that it's very important to document, to bear witness, to make sure that all of these stories are recorded in history in the hope of accountability. But I also think there is a real concern, and Palestinians are having this conversation of, are these graphic images in some ways desensitizing people, normalizing our suffering? I don't know. I think a lot of it goes down to just the deep dehumanization of Palestinians that we're constantly pushing up against.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. And I think something that you both have done so well, and the whole team that worked on the film has done so well, is displaying not only the necessity of telling the loss, telling the story of loss, but really the whole narrative of families living together through displacement. And like you mentioned, Kavitha, this is not something that we're really seeing in Western media outlets at all, even after a full year of Israel clearly intentionally targeting civilians. And that, I think, kind of leads us pretty well into this next clip, which is the story of Hind Rajab's killing. And, her name is probably one that all of us were familiar with even before watching this film. So let's go ahead and play the clip, and then we can go ahead and ask the question.
Eventually, relatives were able to reach the Red Crescent in Ramallah to see if their team in Gaza could send an ambulance.
وصلتنا مناشدة إنه في سيارة استهدفت عند كزية فارس في مدينة غزة.
When Omar called, it was Layan who picked up.
ألو مرحبا عمو. ألو مرحبا.
الدبابة جنبي.
انتوا متخبيين؟
في السيارة، احنا جنبينا الدبابة.
انتوا جوا السيارة؟ الو الو
بنتي تموت معك على التليفون. أنا فصلت، يعني وصلت مرحلة إني أنا صار معي قط. يعني بالنسبة لي أنا مدرب مهيأ لهيك شيء. بس لما توصل لمرحلة طفل شوي هون المشاعر هيك بتفوت ببعض كلها صراحة. بعد ما رجعت رنيت على التليفون على نفس الرقم اللي ردت علي ليان عليه.
الو.
هون اختلف الصوت علي. بسألها بحكي لها البنت اللي كانت تحكي معي وينها؟ هون حكت لي ماتت. هون أنا حكيت مع مين؟ مع هند.
انت تخبي انت وين موجودة بالضبط؟ في السيارة. انت في السيارة قاعدة؟ طب تخبي تحت الكراسي، ما تبيني بالمرة.
After a few minutes, Omar asked other colleagues to help and speak with Hind.
الدبابة وين؟ الدبابة جنبكم؟ ما عم تتحرك ولا واقفة؟ نزل حدا منها؟ لا بتتحرك. طيب هي بتتحرك جنب السيارة ولا هي جاي من ورا السيارة أو من قدام السيارة؟ من قدام السيارة. هي جاية عليكي من قدام السيارة الدبابة؟ نعم. قريبة كتير؟ كتير. وعم تمشي؟
As the Red Crescent dispatchers spoke with Hind, colleagues were trying to get an ambulance to her, something that would require coordination with and approval by Israeli authorities.
حبيبتي صدقيني إنه عم نعمل في تنسيق إن شاء الله يزبط.
Usually ambulances in the whole world, once they got the call, they directly dispatch the ambulances and send to save people's life. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Gaza. Any area that there is Israeli occupation forces, Israel considered as it is a military zone. That means even if there is wounded people, people who are killed and need to be evacuated, we are completely denied access to these areas. And if any ambulance try to reach, it will be targeted. That's why, in order to be able to save Hind, we had to coordinate our safe access.
While they waited for approval, the team continued to speak with Hind.
Hind was screaming for help, was asking again and again to come and rescue her from where she is.
Nisreen works in the Red Crescent's mental health department and tried to help Hind keep her hopes up.
هنود حبيبتي بس خدي نفس وغمضي عينيك شوي، ريحي عينيك شوي، لا إحنا عندك.
In the middle of the exercise, breathing exercise or imagination exercise, she will say, Nisreen, when are you coming to take me? And this has continued on and off all the time, trying to take her direction out of the car, out of the victims around her, out of her murdered family around her. The smell of the blood, can you imagine with me that a 6-year-old is afraid, is hungry, is thirsty, smells blood around her all the time. Dark is coming on soon, and only the phone is her hope. My voice, Rana's voice, Omar's voice, my colleagues, was her only hope.
Eventually, the Red Crescent was able to connect Hind's mother onto the phone with them.
احكي لها هند انت يا ماما بالراحه، انت مصابه؟ انا مطخوخه في ايدي من فوق، وانا مطخوخه في ظهري، وانا مطخوخه في رجلي. يعني انت رجلك بتنزل دم، رجلي بتنزل دم، وايدي بتنزل دم، وظهري بنزل دم.
Finally, nearly 3 hours after requesting clearance. The Red Crescent says Israeli officials gave the approval for the ambulance to go to the scene and provided this map with an approved route.
We had to wait almost 3 hours until the green light was given. So they sent a map with a route, which means it identifies exactly which route the ambulance should take. And once we received the green light, the ambulance was dispatched.
أحلى خبر في الدنيا من عمو عمر.
هند هنود هاي دقيقة واحدة بتكون السيارة عندك بس بتمشي شوي شوي.
محطة فارس وين وصلت؟
The two paramedics who started driving to the scene were Ahmed al-Madhoun and Yusuf Zeno. By the time they left, the sun had set.
شايف السيارة أنت؟ مش شايف مشغل السرينة واللواح؟
The connection to the ambulance was lost right after that loud noise.
يا زينو.
مهند
بخير؟ الحمد لله الحمد لله.
بخير هي بخير.
They had to ask her, did you hear a bomb now? Did you hear anything around you? And she said, yes, I heard it. Her yes means our colleagues who went to rescue her had died.
The phone call with Hind continued, but her voice had started to grow fainter.
في هذه اللحظة هنود كانت تقولها هنود ليش انت بتتكلميش؟ بتقولها بتكلمش بنزل من تمي دم. بتقولها امسحيه في ايدك وقولي لي كمان اذا بنزل كمان دم. بتقولها بديش اوسخ بلوزتي عشان ماما ما تتعبش. قلت لها معلش يا ماما امسحيه وانا بدي اغسل لك يا حبيبتي. قالت لي ماشي. بنت مسحت بكمها زي هيك واختفى الصوت. كانت الساعة 7 بالضبط. اختفى تماما الصوت. قعدنا في المستشفى بيتنا في المستشفى وانه نستنى عدها اجى الهلال عدها اجى الاسعاف. اني انا اطلع يعني في الليل كذا اسعاف اجى افتح السياره اجى انطنط انه بدي بنتي تكون في الاسعاف. ما اجاش الاسعاف.
It would be 12 days before Hind and the two paramedics' fates were confirmed.
Many of us have heard Hind's story. It's really been one of the most popular stories to come out of Gaza from the past year. And, stories like Hind's happen pretty much on a daily basis in Gaza. And many people have missing family members, yet it's rare maybe that we would be able to get a phone call recording of the final moments of their life. And it's even more rare that we're able to get forensic specialists to analyze their killing like you all were able to do with Hind's killing in the documentary. So I'm wondering, could you both discuss what the story of Hind, Leanne, and the emergency responders and the medics in Gaza tell us? And on the other hand, what does their story say about the Israeli army, who, of course, approved of the medics' route to save Hind, yet still bombed the emergency vehicle when it arrived, leaving a 6-year-old girl to die alone, trapped in a car with her dead relatives? We can start with Kavitha again and go to Leila. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the story of Hind and her family and the two Red Crescent workers tells us, or what it's, it has gotten a lot of attention. I think it tells us that it just one more example on the millions of others that Palestinians in Gaza have nowhere to go, that there's no way to be safe. It is yet another example of civilians being deliberately targeted. You know, there's a very, very small chance that the Israeli soldiers in the tanks that shot into that car did not know it was civilians. They clearly were not fired back at. You can hear in the recording, that initial recording with Leanne, that there's only one source of the gunfire. So there's no crossfire. There's that part of it. And then again, you know, from where they were, they would have been able to see. They wouldn't, you know, aside from the fact that they have telescopic lenses, you know, in those tanks, in the Merkava tanks, just from where they were, they would have known. But those are civilians. So it's another example of deliberate targeting of civilians. One more violation of international law. On top of that, you have the deliberate targeting of the emergency workers, something that's happened many times. This is one more example. Yet another very clear violation of international law. And I think one of the things, you know, one of the reasons we focused on it in the documentary was not just the fact that it is obviously a really heartbreaking and powerful story, but it's the way the U.S. government responded to this attack. The Biden administration has been repeatedly asked about this case. And they have gone with, as they've always done, they've done this countless times when they're presented with similar situations, similar attacks of the Israeli military attacking and killing civilians. They simply defer to the Israeli quote unquote investigation, which there's never really a proper investigation. And they have repeatedly, Matt Miller, because he's always asked about it at the State Department thing, usually by Prem Thakur from Zateo, and before that, The Intercept. And he says that the Israeli military has said that they weren't in the area that day. The Israeli military has repeated that line as recently as just a week ago when Sky News put out another report about this attack. The satellite imagery of that attack of that day has been out since February. CNN and Al Jazeera put it out within days of when first responders were able to finally go to the site in February. And so I think this case is just, it's really heartbreaking because and infuriating because you have a situation where the evidence is so clear. We shouldn't have had to even do a forensic analysis. You had two scared children testifying in their final moments about what they saw and who was targeting them. They had there would be no reason for these children to lie when they're just screaming for someone to come save them. And yet we still, you know, our amazing partners at Forensic Architecture and Earshot were able to do this investigation, all open source. The US government could do what has many more things at their fingertips and could do their own investigation if they cared, but they don't. And I think that's just the, you know, the infuriating and heartbreaking reality of it.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. Leila.
Kavitha really put it so well. I don't have, you know, much more to add other than we know there's other Hind Rajabs whose stories have not been told. I don't know if we'll ever know the full extent of the killing in Gaza by the Israeli military because they've killed so many journalists who were doing that really important work and documentation. They've destroyed the hospital system, which gives us a clear count of how many people have been killed. They've really destroyed any way to really keep track of the dead fully. And as Kavitha mentioned, I mean, this isn't new, and it's not the first incident of them targeting civilians simply for existing, and then not taking any responsibility for it, and then targeting the people who are going to rescue the civilians. Just 2 days ago, there was a family in Jabalia camp that had been attacked by the Israeli military. Some of them survived and were injured, others were killed. And they called desperately, and Anas al-Sharif, Al Jazeera's reporter in the north, played a video of them calling desperately saying, please come help us, please send help, please send help. We have injured people in this house. They sent a doctor to go treat them, and he too was killed. I mean, this is absurd. The fact that, you know, Hind Rajab's killing was January 29th, it's now mid-October, and they're still killing first responders. they kill, you know, the highest number of UN workers ever in the history of the United Nations have been killed in Gaza. I think it's like around 300, most of them Palestinian. Again, the highest number of journalists killed since CPJ started keeping count, by far, 175. I mean, Kavitha and I worked on a film, Kavitha directed it, she went to Mexico, about the killing of journalists in Mexico a couple of years ago. And the reason we decided to do that film is because 14 had been killed in 1 year. 177 journalists in Gaza have been killed. This is just unfathomable. And, you know, we know that there's no place safe in Gaza, and we know that civilians are targets. That's it. There's absolutely no distinction between someone carrying a weapon and fighting in Gaza and a civilian. Israelis have been actually quite clear in their genocidal language, as has been documented by the ICJ case and other places. But despite how well documented Hind's cases, there's no accountability, there's no justice. The US has allowed Israel to get away with this, which is why it keeps happening. And if in a case as documented as Hind's, or as documented as Shireen Abu Akla's, which we also worked on that, can't receive justice, then I don't know what can.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like you said, Kavitha, it's heartbreaking and it's also infuriating. And that, you know, leads us into the second half of the title of this film, which is Biden's War on Gaza. So we want to show a clip about that and talk a little bit more about the US complicity in the genocide and a little bit about what we can do at home to help alleviate that. I'm going to share my screen now.
جيش امريكي كله متآمر علينا، امريكا متآمر معاهم، امريكا مش توقف الحرب، ايش دعم امريكا احنا.
I want to say to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
As a staunch ally of Israel, the US provides billions of dollars in military assistance. And from the beginning of the war, the Biden administration made their unwavering support of Israel clear, regardless of the quickly rising civilian toll or the lack of any clear military plan.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly. And it's going to be messy.
You said you'd ask them tough questions, but has the U.S. set or discussed any possible red lines?
No.
President Biden
precision-guided munitions to Israel since October 7th is essentially letting Israel go forward without having to make hard choices.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution...
On the same day Josh Paul resigned, when the death toll had approached nearly 3,500 people in just 11 days,
Those against?
the US vetoed the first ceasefire resolution at the United Nations.
Colleagues, the United States is disappointed this resolution made no mention of Israel's rights of self-defense.
The U.S. at that point says, we're not going for a ceasefire. That's a really striking moment, right? Because the contours of the war are clear at that point, even if the Israeli ground invasion into Gaza has not yet begun. I think that was a moment where it became clear the U.S. in all levels is going to let Israel pursue this military campaign as it sees fit.
What are the chances of a Gaza ceasefire? None. No possibility.
Quienes estén a favor del proyecto de resolución, sírvanse levantar
By
la mano.
December, the US vetoed yet another ceasefire resolution at the UN.
En contra.
By then, more than 17,000 Palestinians had been killed. And that same month, the Biden administration bypassed Congress twice to transfer more weapons to Israel, a move they defended in the media, even as civilian casualties continued to climb.
We want to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against Hamas.
This drew more scrutiny on the use of US weapons and whether or not international law had been broken, particularly when it came to proportionality, meaning that there shouldn't be excessive civilian harm in military attacks, like in this strike on the Jabalia refugee camp in October, where Israel says they were targeting a single Hamas commander, but more than 100 civilians were killed.
There are reasons to be concerned that Israel may have a very expansive definition of military advantage, which would allow for, in turn, a great deal of civilian harm. Dropping a one-ton bomb on a house because there's a single Hamas fighter there, knowing you'll kill his extended family and destroy the entire neighborhood, would likely be excessive and be prohibited by the law of war. This is something that the U.S. government should be investigating and pressing Israel on, because there are U.S. weapons being used in these attacks.
So we just saw these two clips with a lot of really infuriating statements from the Biden administration. And I know with the access that most of us have to technology and therefore global news, it's really easy, at least for me, to get really overwhelmed by the sheer extent of violence and suffering in our world. And I hope that everybody who had the chance to watch the film today before coming on has the time and the space to sit with their body and notice how you feel after watching Palestinians in Gaza speak about their life under genocide. But this film doesn't just tell heartbreaking stories. Critically, it focuses on US complicity in the genocide in Gaza. As Noor said, the subtitle of the film is Biden's War on Gaza. And I'm in this work because I believe that the United States has a unique ability to stop the violence against Palestinians. And films like this one are really great tools for advocates and organizers. So many of the clips in the film demonstrate all of the laws that we could be following in this world. And I'm left outraged that my government is instead choosing to actively support genocidal violence. So I'm curious whether you could speak a little bit tonight about why you think it was important to weave in the narrative of US complicity and what approach you took to finding those voices to share the details of US involvement. And also, I know it's really hard for me, at least, to imagine the future when almost everything that sustained life in Gaza has been destroyed. But what needs to change these people who hold elected power over the next year?
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about, it's interesting, after we actually did the interviews with, here in the US and once we got all the filming done, we were in the edit. There was a point, I know Leila and Sharif, the correspondent, and Audi, our editor, we were having discussion about how exactly we were going to weave in the US role. Was it going to be focused on themes, or how is that thread going to be woven? In the end, it became actually just quite simple. It's chronological. And I think what makes the importance of doing it chronologically and the way it shows all these chances anchored in these families, all these chances that the Biden administration had to stop what was happening in Gaza, to stop Israel, to stop this genocide and suffering, and they didn't. I think Leila and I have both covered, Washington and Washington politics, U.S. government accountability and complicity in different atrocities around the world before. But I think I have to say, I have never seen the level of callousness from any administration, and I'm including the Trump administration in that. I have never seen the level of, callousness, a lack of empathy, just kind of glaring lack of empathy as I've seen from the Biden administration. And I think John Kirby is emblematic of that in particular. He has been in government for a long time. He was a spokesman at the State Department at one point during Obama. And, even, when Leila mentioned, we did a documentary on the killing of our colleague Shireen Abu Akleh, and we went to the White House, and, John Kirby, answered one of our questions about that at the time. And there was a little bit more empathy. At least it felt like maybe he wasn't just brushing it aside. I think something that we've seen from all of the Biden, it really is just, it's really hard to for me to understand how they can just not care at all and so blatantly. And I think what's frustrating as a journalist, so much of like Washington journalism, and which is what can oftentimes push the narrative or push change a bit more, it relies on access journalism. And that's not something that we can be a part of. It's just how it is. That's left to the New York Times, to the Post, the networks. And they don't push the administration at all, like a little bit. There's a little bit there. But I think, there's at the very beginning of that clip, at the beginning, it's like from late October, and John Kirby says, "This is war. It's bloody. People are going to get killed." And nobody pushed back on that in that press room. And that is, to me, disgusting, and it's emblematic of what is wrong with Western media, because there's this idea that I think Arab countries and communities, black and brown communities around the world are just used to violence, and that's fine. And I think we've seen that a lot, when the past few weeks in between what's happened, with the attacks on Lebanon and the kind of like corresponding attacks then on Israel, the difference and how mainstream media have covered that is really, it shows you exactly who they think matters and who doesn't matter. And I think a lot of that's also caught up in the fact that American, Western journalists, both particularly American and British journalists, and American and British press organizations and outlets, I think that they base their understanding and the way they frame their stories in the interests of their own government. So, whether it's this or Ukraine or Afghanistan, everything is about American interests or Western interests. Like, even if it's not completely explicit, that's how it's framed. Yeah. Sorry, I feel like I've just gone on a tangent about how horrible I think our industry is when it comes to this. But I think a lot of it's tied up in the administration itself and a kind of, really bad, toxic relationship that the industry has with the White House and Congress and people in power that they shouldn't have.
Leila, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah. So our show Fault Lines covers the US, whether it's domestic policy and domestic issues, economic inequality, healthcare disparities, the criminal justice system. And if it's a foreign policy issue outside of our region of North and South America and the Caribbean, it has to have a strong US connection. So it was a no-brainer that we were going to focus on the US policy. As Akbar Ahmed, who is a HuffPost reporter who's broken a lot of stories about the dissent within the Biden administration, told our team in the film, he was told by a former Israeli diplomat that this war simply could not be prosecuted without the United States. It's just not possible. Israel depends so much on the US for the weapons, for the funding, for the defense systems, for diplomatic cover, political cover, and that much has been clear. The Biden administration, I think one thing that really shocked people, and this was actually an alternative title for the film that we thought about, No Red Lines. There's just no red lines. Even the Rafah red line turned out to not be a red line at all. There's, I think, appropriate skepticism about this letter that was leaked through Axios's Barak Ravid, who's very close to the Israeli government. He was an IDF reservist until recently, yesterday, that Blinken and the defense secretary wrote to the Israeli government saying, you have 30 days to let in more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And people are rightfully skeptical because there's a US election that will be determined in less than 30 days. And because we've seen the Biden administration impose no red lines, no consequences, it doesn't matter how many civilians are killed, how many 2,000-pound bombs are used in attacks, how the people of Gaza are very clearly starved. None of those things seem to matter. And Israel has sort of been given unfettered, like no strings attached support. So it was important, in addition to civilian casualties and Israeli violence that we documented in the piece, to also look at this US role and to push and to ask questions. And, you know, Sharif and Kavitha went to the White House, tried to get questions in. You saw there's a scene in the film where Sharif tries to ask Blinken a question. We, for months and months and months, requested an interview with the State Department. They declined. They've given very few interviews to Al Jazeera, which tells you exactly how they feel about the people in the region, because, you know, they've given other interviews, and in Al Jazeera, you know, Al Jazeera's audience, like there's no audience that's more connected to this issue, and yet they didn't feel a duty, a responsibility to answer questions from our team, from Al Jazeera. And I think that says it all. I've been thinking a lot the last few months about this quote that Aaron David Miller, who's a former US diplomat, told the New Yorker when they asked him if he thinks that Joe Biden has the same kind of sympathy for Palestinians as he does for Israelis. And he says, do I think that Joe Biden has the same depth of feeling and empathy for the Palestinians of Gaza as he does for the Israelis? No, he doesn't, nor does he convey it. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think that sums up US policy towards the region. It sums up John Kirby crying tears about what turned out to be a fabricated lie, a fabricated story about beheaded babies on October 7th, literally crying real tears. And then being so cold and dispassionate when he talks about Palestinians. Oh, that's just war, to Palestinians being killed. And that lack of feeling, that approach comes out in the policy as well. You see it very clearly.
Thank you both. I think there was someone in the chat who mentioned about these stories countering the narrative, mainstream media, of the dehumanization of Palestinians, and that narrative's not just in mainstream media, but it's all over. So I'm going to take a moment, I think, to let us follow in your footsteps and try to take some action with our frustration and our outrage and our heartbreak. I've just put in the chat a list of 5 things, and I invite you to do at least one of them in the next week. The first is to host your own film screening and really help to resist that dehumanization of Palestinians, not just in the media, but in communities across the United States and across the world. And you can find the film at that short link, or just by Googling "The Night Won't End: Biden's War on Gaza." The second is to increase your reach on that resistance to dehumanization with a letter to the editor. And I'll remind folks that letters to the editor aren't just can be directed beyond elected officials, but also to the mainstream media itself, challenging the coverage that your local paper or a national paper is participating in the dehumanization of Palestinians. And we've got a great tool as part of one of our Action Hour resources on how to write your own letter to the editor. And we've had some folks on our Action Hour who've been successful in publishing these letters. The third thing is a letter to Biden and the office of the vice president. So I've reminded people, and my colleague Nora's reminded people, that the subtitle of this incredible film is Biden's War on Gaza. So direct your heartbreak and your outrage at the right place. The Biden administration can't stop hearing our dissent and our heartbreak and our outrage. And the fourth thing is to attend the Action Hour. We host an Action Hour for Palestine every Friday at noon Eastern. Regularize your practice, regularize your action, and join us in community on the Action Hour. This week, we'll be having student activists on. And the fifth and final thing is to talk about your connection to this issue with friends and family, because that's where we have the most power in humanizing Palestinians and in sharing this issue with the people that matter to us. There's a guide at the last link that I've shared from the American Friends Service Committee on how to have tough conversations with your friends and family. But involving your community is a really important step to make this go beyond you and a film in your living room.
And so I'd like to close out tonight. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I want to know whether you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the people gathered today, Kavitha and Leila, about the film, about what people can do beyond watching the film, and about your frustration, your outrage, your heartbreak as you watch the continuous dehumanization of Palestinians and the genocide continue.
I guess I would just say, please share the film and try to get as many people to watch it. I think the other thing I would say, and it's something that I struggle with, is just to make sure to keep paying attention to Gaza, no matter how horrible it is. I know it's really easy to feel overwhelmed and like you can't do anything. But I think that if you give into that, then what does that mean for Palestinians in Gaza? So I think, even if it's hard and you have to see really horrible images and hear really horrible testimony, like what's in the film, please keep doing it, because, bearing witness is really important. And I think, the Biden administration, I just remembered something that came out, I think it was in November. It was in Politico, and it was like off the record, but these administration sources told Politico that the Biden administration didn't want foreign journalists and Western journalists to get into Gaza because they didn't want people to see what was happening. And this was in November. And so I just want people to remember that the Biden administration does not want you to see what has been happening in Gaza. And so that it is all the more important that you do, and that you make sure that other people do as well.
Thank you, Kavitha. I can't underscore that enough. Do you have a last thought, Leila, you'd like to share with the people who are gathered today?
Thank you all for being here. I know there's a lot you could do on your Wednesday night, so I appreciate you taking the time. I encourage you to please send this film to everyone you know. All 60 people who showed up tonight sent this film to at least one person or 10 people, and encourage them to watch. It is a difficult watch, but educating ourselves, as Kavitha said, bearing witness, that's really the very least we can do. Thank you, Dorina. This is on us, whether we like it or not. As American citizens, as US taxpayers, we are directly involved in this, and the very least we can do is make our voices heard, speak out to the legacy media newsrooms, tell them what you think about their coverage, because you better bet that the other side is, pro-Israel groups have sustained campaigns reaching out to these newsrooms, pushing them to support Israel. And they do listen, they read the letters, they read the emails. So make your voices heard as much as possible, whether it's to your politicians, local elected politicians, national politicians, political campaigns, but also newsrooms as well, because obviously we know that the media coverage is so instrumental in the way that people see all of this. And thank you again.
Thank you all so much. I have one last link to share with you all, and that's afsc.org/commit-Palestine. And that's a collection of resources for campus activists and organizers, faculty and students. If you have anyone in your life who is on campus and would like to organize a screening of this film, it would be really incredible if more students and young people across the country had access. And so I'll put that link in the chat in a moment. But as we leave today, I want to leave us with a quote from the end of the film from Hind's mother. She says, "May God give us patience. We belong to God, and to him we will return." That's all I can say. I can't say any more than that. Thank you all for being on tonight. if you'd like to put a number in the chat on which of the actions, the 5 actions that I shared today, you're committing to take over the next week as you leave, feel free.